Let's continue here now with our conversation. One of our top stories this afternoon, we will be speaking to Professor Anthony Turton. He's a former military intelligence analyst. Of course, our big story this afternoon are those tavern shootings that we saw in the early hours, mostly of yesterday morning and one yesterday. Prof Turton, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Good afternoon to you and the listeners.
Prof, what can we make of these shootings? I mean, they are of concern, because of just the motives have not yet been found to date. And of course, it seems like, these suspects came into these establishments and started shooting indiscriminately. Of course, we heard the good news that in the KZN instance, 2 people have been arrested, in this particular case. But what can we make of these shootings in recent times?
Well, yes, this is, I wouldn't say it's an unusual event for KZN. I mean, KZN is well known for the fact that it has got an undercurrent of violence. There's a Center for the Study of Violence at the University of KZN, and they've been monitoring this for a long period of time. So it is a violent area. But to suddenly walk into a tavern like that and open up a fire, that is something unusual. And that goes back to some of the incidents that took place in the 1980s, where similar incidents occurred. So we can't say that it's exactly the same thing, but it certainly is something that raises concern.
Now, we've heard, of course, from law enforcement authorities who have been visiting these areas, just this past day. And so violent crime is on the increase in South Africa, and it has been, for some time. Is alcohol really at the center of this problem, or do we have a problem with gun violence in this country?
Look, I always smile a little bit when the officials tell us that it's alcohol related. Yes, alcohol is an accelerating factor, but it's not necessarily the driver of the problem. Where you get people together in a small confined space and alcohol is involved, obviously people party a bit too much and they maybe do silly things that they otherwise wouldn't do. But alcohol is not the fundamental driver of these problems. These are the simmering undercurrents of tension within the country, probably driven by growing frustration at the inability to find work. You can't expect to have 50% of the population unemployed and people to continue to be happy.
And Prof, let's talk about, just the kind of weapons that are being used. I mean, we heard from Police Minister Bekicele saying 100 AK-47 cartridges were found on the scene of that shooting in Orlando, in Soweto. Talk to us about the kinds of weapons that are being used. Are we supposed to then be concerned? Because, I mean, as a police commissioner in KZN said earlier, some of these guns are obtained legally. They are then stolen, and he said what's quite worrying is that some of them are stolen from armed security guards.
Well, AK-47s are military assault rifles. In my personal opinion, they don't have any legitimate role in a civilian society, in the hands of civilian people. They're designed to kill. They're very, very robust combat weapons, probably some of the best combat assault rifles in the world. But I know once again, I go back to the 1980s, there was just a huge number of those weapons flowing over the border from Mozambique in the 1980s. And in fact, I was involved directly in an operation in the early 1990s to stop the flow of those very same weapons. So we unfortunately have a situation now where Mozambique is also starting to become unstable. We see all of that activity in the north part of the country. So it's not impossible that we're going to start seeing a movement of these weapons of war from a war-torn area back into South Africa. This is unfortunate but true.
And now one would wonder then, Prof, surely the intelligence should then come in here, particularly because these crimes are happening, straight after the July unrest, and we are celebrating or commemorating, 1 year on since the July unrest. But surely it's a case then of law enforcement authorities making sure that these guns, first of all, don't make it into the country and don't circulate once they are in the country. What then is the problem as far as law enforcement, in as far as intelligence is concerned? Is there concern here again that they are, not, maybe even sleeping on the job?
Well, I think the facts speak for themselves. The purpose of an intelligence structure is to give you forewarning, or what is known as actionable intelligence. It doesn't help if you've got information in your hands and you can't action it. So actionable intelligence is what's designed, designed to produce. One need look only at the bill. You know, the taxpayer is paying a huge amount of money for our different intelligence structures, and the question is, are we getting value for money? And then we have to look no further than the infighting that's been taking place in crime intelligence. It's always been a hotbed of activity in fighting. And then, we have a situation where some of the top generals in the police are also at loggerheads with each other. I just recently read an article where one of the police generals is actually fearful of her life because of infighting at top level. So I think the whole police service specifically is unstable. But if you widen that up to the broader intelligence community or security cluster, I think the security cluster is not in a healthy situation at the moment, and I doubt very much that they are in a position to provide actionable foreknowledge, which is exactly why they were there, why they were set up in the first place.
It is perhaps that instability that we are seeing in the security cluster and also in the law enforcement authorities, perhaps the SAPS. One of our reporter just, did an insert in terms of just the increase of demand of firearms following the July unrest, especially by civilians, So one then asks the question, are guns the solution, or is this a sign that civilian confidence in the police, in law enforcement, is at an all-time low, that, people now need to arm themselves?
I think you touched on an important point there, the thing about confidence. I think there's no confidence in the police when the minister gets engaged in a slanging match with a member of the public. That's completely undermines confidence. There's no confidence when the generals are at each other's throats. There's no when a former senior official of the intelligence community goes and lays a charge against the president for some or other alleged crime, and then himself is implicated in a whole bunch of nefarious activities. So the whole thing just does not give confidence at all. And this is part of the problem, because you must remember that the sole purpose of the state is to provide security for the citizens. And when the citizens feel insecure, then the citizens start to arm themselves. And we saw this happening a year ago in the July unrest 2021, when the police were unable, they were literally unable to respond. And within a very short period of time, you got armed militia coming onto the streets. And for the most part, those armed militia were very, very stable, and they didn't act like vigilantes. They were generally acting in quite a restrained way. But I was very surprised seeing the number of bristling off the back of buckies. But society is armed now, and they are going to take the law into their own hands, and that's the problem now, because you now start seeing the possibility of vigilante action, and then, of course, you start seeing a deterioration of law and order. So it's important that the state must take control without fear or favor, and must be seen to be in control. Otherwise, your vigilante action is probably going to simply grow.
Prof, just on that note, we have talked about the fact that there is low confidence. Just on your last point, how then does a law enforcement authority make sure that they take back control? Because it would seem that the problem now that we are seeing is at township level, and it is concerning. I mean, also we've seen those numerous attacks in the Western Cape as well, earlier this year, and in fact towards the latter part of last year. So it seems that it is spread to all the big provinces particularly. So how do they begin to take back control and have the public confidence?
Yes, that's a great question. I think if you go back a year ago to the July unrest of 2021, to me, the big lesson that came out of that, I actually saw three lessons coming out of that, but the big lesson, the main lesson that came out of that was the myth that the state is in control. It is clear that government does not have the capacity. In fact, there's a power vacuum at leadership level, and there's a power vacuum that simply projects itself over the entire country. So in the absence of a credible leadership that is seen to be in control, you can't expect to have your foot soldiers, your constables being in control. And in fact, last year we saw for example, that policemen were confined to barracks. They didn't have the equipment to get out to the front lines. We saw that policemen running out of ammunition. We saw civilians actually providing the police with ammunition in places like Amanzimtoti, etc. So the government has to fill the power vacuum in a credible way without fear or favor. And we ultimately get back to this whole thing about law and order. Are we a country based on the rule of law? Because if we're based on the rule of law, then the same law must apply to everybody. And prosecution must happen without fear or favor. And unfortunately, what's happening now is that some people are apparently able to get away with a whole range of crimes, and the public has simply lost confidence in government because they're saying that government is failing to prosecute without fear or favor. And we've got to get back to that. We've got to restore the rule of law.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Prof, for your time and for coming on here, asking very pertinent questions there. Are we a country based on the rule of law? That was former military intelligence analyst, Professor Anthony Turton.